let's get me in a better mood. Without further ado, let's get down to some business, shall we?
Let's do it.
Well, and as everybody knows, we alluded to at the top of the program a couple weeks ago, I asked, after all the kerfluffle over the holidays, should I be a kinder, gentler Jim Cornette in 2016? And, of course, all the fans, they're writing on Twitter, at the Jim Cornette. They're emailing me, jimcornette@jimcornette.com. They're taking out billboards. No, we like you just the way you are. Fuck them if they can't take a joke. Don't change a goddamn thing. The people who dislike me, as we spoke about last week on the program, are the people that don't listen to this show anyway. But they think that I'm just miserable and mad and bitter and fucking screaming at people all the time. And, hey, you kids, get off my fucking lawn. Actually, kids in this neighborhood know not to get on my lawn. But anyway, so even though my fans are against it, other people who don't like me probably don't care, but I feel like I should try. So I have hired an anger management therapist, somebody who can make me see the positive side, the fun side, the good things, the laugh a minute things that are life in 2016 and in professional wrestling. And I recently guested on a podcast with an old friend of mine, Brian Last. He and David Bixenspan do the brand new podcast out there, 605 The Super Podcast. And they talk about wrestling, but not the same old topics that you hear from everybody else, and not just what happened last Monday on Raw and whatever. But Brian has a tremendous knowledge of wrestling, both past and present. But he has very skewed outlooks on some things and some very interesting connections. But I had great feedback on my appearance because people said, "God, Cornette seems so happy. It was a lot of fun. Boy, I haven't heard him laugh like that." And I thought, well, Brian always seems to bring that out in me. We've known each other for 20 years, met when he was a young, underage, teenage fan coming down to the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Fan Weeks from Long Island. I don't usually admit when I meet underage young men that travel long distances to see me, but nevertheless, anyway, he brings the best out of me because we have a great history. We've known each other a while. And as I said, he has an incredible pedigree as a wrestling fan, which we're going to go into. But ladies and gentlemen, right now, I would like to introduce my new anger management therapist. It's going to be ongoing. It's a work in progress. It took me 54 years to get this miserable. I don't think he can do it in a week, but please welcome him. He's the only fan ever at an SMW fan week to actually punch out another fan. And this is my anger management therapist, ladies and gentlemen, the great Brian Last. Brian, thank you for being on the program.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Jim, please lay down on the couch. Tell me about your mother. I understand she bought you a bodyguard named Bubba.
Yes.
I understand Bubba let you down and two Chicago bikers caused you to take a great fall. How did that make you feel?
You've either had therapy or you've done therapy before.
Neither, somehow. I don't know how that's worked, but I have lucked out of it. But it's great to be here.
I was telling M before we went on the air, and I want you to tell this story because M didn't believe me. But I guess possibly what has caused you to turn out the way you have, whether that's positive or negative, is the entertainment. Because you were a wrestling fan at an early age. And how old are you now? Tell the folks.
I am now 36 somehow.
36 years old. You're bar mitzvah, which I understand, even though I'm not of the Jewish faith. But I understand that's when you're 13, right?
That's correct.
So 23 years ago, before anybody else had the pleasure of meeting the Archbishop of Talentberry, Vince Russo, he was actually the entertainment at your bar mitzvah. Tell us that story, please.
I will tell that story. It is a story I previously mentioned on my podcast with David Bixenspan, 605, the Super Podcast, the only podcast on Turner Time. And there's a long-form version of the story on YouTube. If you just Google or put in YouTube, Vince Russo bar mitzvah, you'll get about a half hour of hilarity.
And a lot of people, I didn't even know he's Jewish.
Exactly. Basically, what it comes down to is this. In the summer of 1992, Vince Russo had a radio show on Long Island called Vicious Vincent's World of Wrestling. I was 12 years old. I argue that if you were a teenager who wasn't yet reading the newsletters, it was a pretty cool show. He liked the heels. If you wanted to get into his good graces, you would call up and say, woo! And then he would do it back at you, which, considering the relationship between him and Ric Flair, is pretty funny. And it was a really cool show. And it was him and his sidekick, the Matt Rat, who was the geeky guy who liked all the baby faces. And then Skull Von Cruss.
Yeah, by the way, Matt Rat was that Bill Banks.
He got a
job. Yeah, I believe it was. I think it was.
I think his name was Jimmy. That's why.
No, Jimmy. That's right. At Bill Banks, he got a job, and Bill was carrying his papers around. But Jimmy was the other guy that he got a job there in the WWF magazine department, so he could have. He was trying to build a little group of disciples. But go ahead.
I don't know why this reminded me of it. Back then, he had a producer on his radio show that he called Jobber Rob. And they did a bus trip one day, and they forgot to pick him up for the bus trip. And that was the last anyone ever heard of Jobber Rob. He was never on the show again. But anyway, I was a big fan of the show. Cool show. Skull Von Crust was Vince's, he cheered for the heels along with Vicious Vincent. And his theme song was Springtime for Hitler, because Skull Von Crust was a Nazi sympathizer. He was late era Nazi gimmick.
Actually, and he would appear anytime Russo got unrestricted use of a book somewhere. Skull Von Crush would appear, and he even called me one time at home. Russo gave me my kayfabe, my bat phone number in Connecticut. I'm just wanting to get a tryout. Anyway, so Russo and Skull Von Crush.
Right, the only Nazi with a Staten Island accent, and
by the way, it's good to bring a Nazi to a bar mitzvah.
You know what? I to this day will argue I'm the only Jewish kid in the world to have a showdown with a Nazi wrestler at his bar mitzvah. Unless, Hans Schmidt appeared at a bar mitzvah way back that we don't know about. But I'm fairly certain I'm the only one. And when it was coming time for my bar mitzvah, I was a tremendous fan of the show. And my mother knew that wrestling was my real love in life at that time. And she wanted me to have the wrestler who was my favorite. And she reached out to Ric Flair through the World Wrestling Federation and was giving some giant price, so we didn't get him. And then she said, well, I know you like this radio show. Let me reach out to them and see if we can book it.
I'm sure they work much more affordably.
Oh yeah, I believe it was $500, for that. So
that would have been, ladies and gentlemen, that would have been his biggest payoff, Russo's biggest payoff in wrestling, possibly. Anyway,
I'm by far, I'm actually quite certain that it would have been his biggest payoff in wrestling at that time. Skull Von Crust too, probably. And they appeared at my bar mitzvah, and I had a little bit of a showdown in front of all the many guests with this giant Nazi wrestler who, after he was done, he pushed me. And then I pushed him back, and then he lifted me over his head, and he paraded me around a little bit, and then he put me down. So there was no finish at all to this whole little angle that we were doing.
That's what I was going to. That's the biggest thing is the big spot, the big finish was the evil Nazi picks up the little Jewish kid, carries him around in the air, and then sets him down, and everybody laughs and has cake. That was the finish.
Why couldn't you low blow him and give him a DDT?
That didn't come to me at that time. And
see, if you're paying for this thing, you should be booking it and putting yourself over.
If I was going to do what I wanted to do, I would have been sleeping with all the dancers we had at the bar mitzvah. But that's a whole.
Because Brian's been that way even when he was young. But now here's the thing. Here's the thing. If this had been 23 years later, you could have had both the Young Bucks come for $500 and super kick you for your birthday, and there would have been a finish.
Yeah, but I don't know. The Young Bucks, I'm not a big fan of them. And then after we were done with everything, Skull Von Crust put on a tracksuit and danced the night away on the dance floor. So that's the short form version of the bar mitzvah story.
And this is the kind of stories, ladies and gentlemen, that you can hear when you if you go to 605 the Super Podcast. Well, you've been talking, and I told you we talked on the phone a couple days ago, and I told you about the problems. I've been trying to listen to your most recent shows. And I got the thing where either I'm on the headset because my ears are bad, I've got the hearing issue, and so I can hear good, or elsewise if I unplug the headset to go more than 6 feet away from the computer, my speakers are shitty and I can't hear the show. So I haven't heard the shows yet, but you have a couple of shows recently. You talked about two so obscure, offbeat wrestling stories that just appeal to me. You've always had that incredible knowledge of offbeat wrestling, inside knowledge for an outsider, but you always seem to be able to get in. You befriended Bill Watts, which is almost impossible as a fan.
At the Eddie Gilbert Memorial Show in '97, I befriended Bill Watts, and we had a tape party, and I got to show him Handicap Pro Wrestling from Japan. That's how in I got. I got to watch his reaction to a bunch of disabled people wrestling in Japan.
Well, and he actually sent you to show you how much Watts liked you. He actually sent you old tapes. This is before, I guess, his divorce settlement. But he sent you some old house show tapes from Mid-South, some of the old 16 millimeter film, some old Freebird stuff. We've just had a ball over that over the last 15 years or so. But you have this talent to be able to worm this information out of people. And a couple of the topics you've been talking about on the podcast lately, were the problems that Danny Jack Donovan and Mario Galento had in Memphis, and of course the incomparable, the infamous Hangman, Bruce. What was his last name? Bruce
Hobans.
I don't want you to give your whole podcast away, but briefly talk about the Hangman for the folks who don't know it, and what else you've been doing on the podcast over there lately.
Right. The podcast is 605, the Super Podcast, hosted by myself and noted wrestling journalist and occasional internet troublemaker David Bixenspan. And we talk classic wrestling. We talk some fringe wrestling characters, but we try to focus on classic wrestling, telling fun stories, telling all sorts of things. You know, one of the things we do on the show is an idea that Jim gave us when he was on our show a couple weeks ago. We do a Dennis Carluzzo story every week. And we tell a great story about a friend of mine, a friend of Jim's, the late great promoter of independent wrestling from New Jersey, Dennis Carluzzo, one of the most unique people out there. And in fact, in a minute, I'm going to have to ask you something about him that we talked about on my show. But in the last few weeks, we've talked about a couple different topics, including Mario Galento. Bo James, the king of Kingsport, on his podcast released audio from 1974 of Mario Galento talking about an incident that had taken place the previous week, I believe, or a few weeks before that, live on Memphis TV, where he, for whatever reason, was, I guess, bribed by Roy Welch, or with the promise of a bribe, to go to the ring and attack Jerry Jarrett. Jerry Jarrett was wrestling Jerry Lawler at the time. Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett stopped having their match and just beat the living shit out of Mario Galento on live TV.
Yeah, because it was live TV. Yeah, and the people in Memphis somewhat knew who Mario Galento was because he'd been on the cards on and off there for 15 years, but he was an insane, he was a very country, very hillbilly, old outlaw style wrestler. He was tough as nails and not too bright. And he had chased after the assassins in Atlanta on Atlanta TV one time, brought a double-barreled shotgun into the TV studio when they were at Channel 11 back in the 60s. And Roy Welch was the benefactor of Jerry Jarrett and the one who got him involved in the business. But as Jerry Jarrett tells the story himself on the Memphis Heat documentary, there's a bunch of Galento stories on there, including Lawler telling the story, but in the bonus features. But Roy had been convinced by somebody, who knows who it was, that Jerry was trying to steal the territory because Jerry had taken the book in Memphis that Roy had given him and then opened up Louisville and Evansville and Lexington. And so Roy decided that something had to be done. And this was at a time where apparently, he had Alzheimer's and he passed away a few years later. He was not right in the head at this point. And he gets Galento, I guess figured I'd give you a fucking, push, kid, give you a spot, book you again if you go in and do this for me. And it didn't work out well at all, did it?
No, he originally offered it to Billy Wicks, who wisely turned it down. And then Galento was ready for the money and did it. And, you bring up him chasing the assassins with a shotgun. One of the things we talked about on the program was he had a wife named Smokey, and he never smartened her up, or at least hadn't before she was a worker back then. And she would sit in the front row at these shows in Atlanta. And eventually Louis Tillett and, I forget who, maybe Lester Welch, forced him to smarten her up because she was pulling a gun on the wrestlers every week from ringside. Everyone who wrestled, she would pull a gun on them.
Basically she carried it in her purse. Everybody remembered Smokey Galento, and he had to smarten her up because she was going to shoot somebody one night. And his daughter, Barbara, became a wrestler also. As a matter of fact, they had a self-published autobiography of Mario Galento, which I got at the Charlotte Fan Fest a couple of years ago. And Mark James, damn him, bought it away from me because it's one of a kind. But he tells his entire story of how he had to smarten up his wife and to smarten up his daughter begrudgingly because they were involved in all of this. But he was well known for being off his rocker.
Right. So he goes on the radio, and he goes on the radio actually on a Saturday morning against Memphis wrestling. And his revenge for not just the incident that happened on Memphis TV where he felt he was double-crossed. And then, of course, he went after Jerry Lawler with a straight razor, and Jim White stuck a gun in his mouth to get him away from there. So two different incidents. His revenge was to go on Memphis radio and expose the business. And he starts talking about it being predetermined and talking about his training school and everything. And the highlight of that is probably one woman who calls in saying she thought maybe it might be fixed because she called the police station and they laughed at her when she encouraged them to go down to the television station to, quote, stop the murder that was happening on TV.
Stop the murder was the quote. The Memphis police were used to getting calls about the Memphis wrestling show because remember back in the 80s when Eddie Gilbert ran over Lawler in the parking lot, he took that great bump over the car. They called. That's why Lawler had to blow the angle and come back out. That's right. And be seen later on in the program because so many people called the police that the cops came down to Channel 5 and said, look, we got shit to do. Get Lawler back out there so everybody sees he's fucking living. Because everybody thinks he's dead and they want Eddie Gilbert arrested. With Memphis, it attracted things like that. It seemed like because there was always people trying to jockey for position. And Dandy Jack Donovan fit in that category as well. I'd always heard that story, but got more details after you told it, and then I looked up some things on the internet. But Dandy Jack Donovan got sideways with Tojo Yamamoto one night here in Louisville.
Right, I was able to actually track down what show it was on thanks to your wonderful book, Tuesday Night at the Gardens. And
available at JimCornette.com.
Go there now and buy it. Buy one for your neighbor and your girlfriend. Yes. And we were able to track down the exact date, and then we actually read a transcript of Jack Donovan's interview with Scott Teal in an old Whatever Happened To newsletter, where he talks about the entire incident. Him and Tojo got crossed up in the ring. You know, you could argue who did what to who and why. And then the next day they were recording interviews, and there was a locker room incident where allegedly Dandy Jack Donovan was jumped in the dressing room by Tojo Yamamoto and Jackie Fargo and Jerry Jarrett. And that was the end of his career working for the west side of the Tennessee territory. And he had been in really well with John Kazana and the eastern Tennessee territory out of Knoxville. But that was the end of him working for Gulas Welch. And we read Jack Donovan's story. Then we read Len and Joe Rossi's story, which backs up Jack Donovan's story. And then Jerry Jarrett, we found online, he had written a reply saying that none of it happened, you know, the way that everyone else said it.
Well, it happened, but and here's the thing. And by the way, Danny Jack Donovan and Ron Wright for folks, and Bo James, King of Kingsport. By the way, Bo, we're going to have Bo on in the future because he's got a new history of East Tennessee wrestling coming out, and I'm just going to get all over that.
Wait.
But
can't wait.
Because this is really some outlaw old time stuff. Because East Tennessee was a place all its own. But Donovan and Ron Wright sold out, I guess, like 6 weeks in a row. I always heard in '73 in like 5,000 people a week in Knoxville. So he was big over there. But Jarrett's story, obviously, they did interviews in Nashville at, I believe, Channel 2, I think it was, every Wednesday. And the Louisville match has been the night before. So Jarrett's story was that Len Ross, Donovan had called him, and then he'd called Tojo because he wasn't in Louisville that night. And he was trying to find out what was going on. And then the next day at TV, Len Rossi came up to him. They just did interviews. This wasn't a studio show, I don't think, at that time. It was just interviews they did on Wednesdays. And Len Rossi came up to him and said, well, Donovan's coming, and, you know, he had some trouble, and I know Tojo's your friend, but Donovan's my friend. Because Len Rossi was always Nick's booker, and with the Birmingham, Nashville end of the territory, there were two circuits. And whereas Jarrett's guys were always on the Memphis end, Len Rossi was the booker for the Birmingham end and was closer to Nick Gulas himself. So it was lining up where it was going to be Len Rossi and Donovan again, and possibly Joey against Jarrett and Tojo and Fargo, which would have been an interesting situation. But Jarrett says, and I tend to believe him, that Tojo and Donovan went in the room and closed the door, and they heard a bunch of shit. And when they opened the door, Donovan was laying on the ground bleeding. Tojo had beat the fuck out of him with his shoes. Of course, Donovan says it was Tojo, Fargo, and Jarrett, all three. Who knows? They didn't have the cameras rolling, but at the same time, that was the way you handled things back then, right? If, you know, the guy, they got crossed up in the night before in the match, and I believe it was, didn't Tojo say that Donovan went for his eyes?
I don't, even Donovan admits that he did, because the story is that Jack Donovan and Bearcat Wright had turned babyface in, I want to say, Birmingham, and it had done really well. And then they brought that to maybe Chattanooga, and Chattanooga did really well. And they were going to bring it to Louisville the next week. But the night of the show, it was going to be Tojo going over Jack Donovan. And Jack Donovan, you know, he said, wait a minute, I'm turning babyface next week. It doesn't make much sense having Tojo go over me this week. Let's do something else. Let's work something else out. And at that time, Jerry Jarrett wasn't there. Nick Gulas was on vacation. Christine Jarrett was nowhere to be found. So he was dealing with Ronnie West, and Ronnie West couldn't get him an answer. So he went
and to be quite perfectly honest, Christine Jarrett never messed in finishes, was never consulted, nor did she stick her nose in. She was strictly about the building business, the tickets, licenses, etc. She did not mess in booking at all. So if they'd gone to her and said, "Can we change the finish?" she'd have said, "I don't know why you're talking to me." and everybody knew that. Everybody knew that.
And his story is he went in the ring and he was working with Tojo, and Ronnie West was the referee there. So he'd been the person he had been liaising with, trying to find a solution to this. And Tojo, according to him, got especially stiff. And at that point in time, he stuck his finger into Tojo's eye. I mean, he admits that that's what he did.
Yeah. But once again, now it's like the guys, I see you're going to have to bring me down from this ledge now already, anger management therapist. Now the guys are like, "Oh, did you take my video game or whatever?"
I'll bring you back down. I remember actually the reason I knew the name Dandy Jack Donovan, because there isn't really much footage of him out there. And obviously, he stopped working in Memphis in '73. So he didn't do too much that would be around for people to find right now. But the reason I knew who he was from Smoky Mountain Wrestling Night of Legends, which I attended in 1994.
Yes, he was there.
You had him there. That's right.
And his wife was a wrestler named Vern Bottoms.
That's right.
So now that we have completely run off all the listeners to the Jim Cornette Experience, let's get a little more current. What do you think about the announcing situation now? Is announcing now turning into being the best part of wrestling, with JR on New Japan coming up in March, and Mauro Ranallo, who was just on? By the way, folks, if you want to get a VIP membership to MLW and go back, because Mauro was on the program last year. What? I guess November-ish or whatever. May have been his last high-profile event before he went to the Evil Empire. And Kevin Kelly's on Ring of Honor. Is it a new age of announcing is what I'm asking.
I don't know. I was certainly a major fan of Mauro Ranallo's work on New Japan. I think his work there was the best work anyone's done in professional wrestling in a generation. I think it was just stellar. And I was upset that he was leaving to go to World Wrestling Entertainment, because the next thing you know, he's going to be able to he's not going to be able to say certain words, and they're going to change him doing this. And everyone, Joey Styles, when he started, and I'm not a big Joey Styles fan, but when he started doing commentary for them after that ECW one night only pay-per-view event, they slowly started changing him. Don't say this, say this. Don't use the guy's complete name. So I worry about that, because again, Mauro was. He hit a level that no one else has hit in a very long time on commentary. When it comes to Jim Ross, time will tell. I was a major Jim Ross fan from Mid-South, UWF, and then WCW. And I think at times I wasn't crazy about his WWF, WWE stuff, but again, he was being produced and he had someone yelling at him in a headset. So that's not always an easy way to work. But he'll be working with Josh Barnett, and he'll be working in a setting that people have respect for him. And hopefully he does really well. But overall,
Barnett does a great job too. Amazingly enough, for a guy who, his primarily wrestling exposure has been Japanese wrestling, but he's a good broadcaster for an athlete.
Yeah,
I would love, and once again, Ring of Honor fans, if any of you indeed do listen to this program, I love Kevin Kelly's announcing, and that's why he's there in that spot. He was my only pick, really, for the lead announcer for Ring of Honor on Sinclair. And all due respect, Steve Corino, and I don't want to give people the impression I don't like Steve, because we've been friends 15 years, but I had originally envisioned Adam Pearce in that spot, sort of as a Mauro Ranallo, Josh Barnett, or a Mike Goldberg, Joe Rogan team, where here was a guy that is well-spoken, does great promos, it has a good look, is an ex-jock, but still articulate enough so he can bring that, Joe Rogan's an anomaly, even though he never fought. He's the biggest fight in the world.
Yeah.
But, somebody like that had not been overexposed. And now that Adam Pearce is working with NXT, I think at some point they got to put him sit him down in a suit. He's a good looking man, and put a microphone in front of him and see how he calls matches. Because I think he'd do a really good job also. But then we got to upgrade the quality of the wrestling, don't we?
We do. I mean,
the announcers are so good.
Going back to the commentary, though, I mean, part of my problem is it's very hard for me to watch a lot of contemporary wrestling because I hate the commentary teams. Monday Night Raw is unwatchable to me. It has to watch it on mute because JBL and Michael Cole and that other guy who adds nothing to the broadcast are just awful. And the problem is they produced all of these other cookie cutter announcers and then sent them out into the world. So you have Josh Matthews over here, and you have Matt Stryker over here. And I don't know them as people, so who knows? They're awful. They're terrible.
I've worked with Stryker, and he actually interviewed me for RF Video, and he's an old-time wrestling fan, and he's a nice guy. I think he could have been produced better by people who knew more about wrestling, but there weren't any of those people in his ear in WWE. With who did you just mention besides
Josh Matthews?
Josh Matthews is apparently just a blithering idiot, because not only did he one time knock JR on Twitter and got slapped down from a variety of places, but also he apparently, I don't watch, but every time I see any mention of his work, it's always, he just says ridiculous things like, this is the biggest announcement in the history of wrestling, and this is the greatest match in the history of wrestling. And people are going, what the fuck? Yeah. The announcers, and that's the thing that Em, have you gone to sleep?
Okay. No, I'm right here. I'm fascinated. Well, I mean, as a former commentator, I'm very interested in hearing.
And as Boyd Pierce used to say, he used to say that he came from a family of potatoes of modest means. And he met a rich potato, and he wanted to marry her, but her parents wouldn't allow it because they said Boyd is just a commentator. But but anyway, announcers are your salesmen. If you go into Sears, right? If you go into Sears in the appliance department and you're trying to buy a refrigerator, you want to talk to somebody that's going to tell you the positives and negatives about all the different kinds of refrigerators, and that appears to know more about it than you do to help you make an informed decision. As soon as wrestling announcers open their mouths and reveal that they know less about the business, whether they know it or just they're being directed to know less, then the fans watching is when the fans lose faith in their announcers and tune them out. And then your announcer is no good at selling your product because he has no credibility.
You know, one of my favorite, before Mauro Ranallo, when there's that whole area where I wasn't crazy about anyone, but I actually, and I'm not kissing up here, loved you in OVW because you in OVW reminded me so much of Bill Watts in Mid-South. And it makes sense. And it makes sense. Yeah, because you guys owned the company, you were booking the company, you understood where things were supposed to go and how to explain them so people understood what they were supposed to think and why things were going where they were going.
It's a dangerous position to get in because and actually Joe Koff wanted me to do color with Kevin Kelly in Ring of Honor, but I was more valuable, I thought, in the truck, giving cues and time cues and signals and etc. and relaying information and or producing the overall show instead of being tied to the announce desk out there. But when someone is like Watts, either he owned and he had a booker that worked with him and did things that fit his vision, or when a booker is the color guy, it's always good in that they know exactly what information to impart. You know what you want the fans to think. You know what you want the fans to hear. You know about your guys and where they're going and what they're doing. So that part is good, but you can get trapped out there. If you have a backup, use it, because you get trapped out there and then the whole show suffers because the announcing may be good, but the show suffers if you don't have somebody in the back that they can consult while you're out there tied to the desk. And luckily with OVW, I was able, not only did I write everything down because I got the OCD and give people notes and things to back up what I had told them, but also I had Danny Davis back there and a few other people back there that could help out and answer questions. But that's the thing is, you know, a wrestling announcer needs to be able to tell the fans who this talent is, why they're attractive or unattractive, why you should like them or dislike them, why the two entities are mad at each other, why the shows are important, why you should buy tickets to see such and such.
That's right.
And they don't need to be drugged down into being one of the gimmicks on the show, or to be made to seem stupider than the fans watching, or to not know what the fuck they're talking about, because that's just ridiculous. That's John Madden. Did he know anything about football? Yes. That's why he was on the fucking thing. It wasn't because he was a beautiful, handsome man. So the more that Kevin Dunn goes for, in my opinion, and they loved Michael, and I like Michael Cole as a person, but he wasn't a natural. He's never been a natural, and he's been badly produced. But he got the job and was pushed over ahead of Kevin Kelly, who had a ton of experience and product knowledge and experience in smaller promotions, including down in Florida. May have been before your time. But Michael Cole had done real news reporting and had been a war correspondent and had that TV friendly, he said, and that's why that decision was made. And
that's the reason they like Byron Saxton as well, is because his background was in
maybe
TV
I have not
news.
seen that guy, so I don't know, but I'm pretty much guaranteed.
That's the new announcer on Raw.
There you go. Then that's exactly because once again, Vince, Kevin Dunn, all those people, they don't want to admit they're in the wrestling business. They're self-conscious of it. They want people to think that they're in television overall, and they're big TV producers, and they want real television people working for them instead of wrestling people. And that's what happens when that happens.
Well, as you said, I'm sure Michael Cole and JBL.
And I'll tell you what, that just HDNet, when Access was HDNet, and the Ring of Honor show that HDNet had on with Mike Hogwood and Dave Prazak. I love Dave Prazak. He was not the greatest announcer in the world, but I like him as a fan, promoter, et cetera, like him as a person. That Mike Hogwood.
Yeah.
I
couldn't stand to watch the program when I was working for him. And I actually.
Well, do you know who he replaced?
Who did he replace?
He replaced me. I was Prazak's
I did not even know that.
Yeah, before they were on HDNet, Prazak and I were the Ring of Honor announcers.
Well, there you go. See, and that when I came back to Ring of Honor after being gone for 3 years, they were already in that spot. And when I got a chance to have a meeting with the HDNet TV people and had brought Kevin to the meeting and said, look, you now have this Mike Hogwood. He's done regional sports in the Carolinas. He's from the Carolinas. He's done football, basketball, whatever. But we won't live long enough. None of us in this room will live long enough for him to be a good wrestling announcer. So here is a guy who has 15 years experience and who's worked for the biggest promotion in the world and done major league broadcast television and live pay-per-view. I would like you to consider bringing him on. And that's when I found out that Mike Hogwood was one of the best friends of one of the fucking HDNet people, and it wasn't going to change.
I actually did commentary with Dave Prazak years ago for Dennis at the NWA Eddie Gilbert Memorial Show.
Oh my God. Well, I didn't know either one of you had ever done commentary. So here I'm talking about commentary with two commentators.
I did commentary with Prazak and with Nick Bockwinkel, who corrected my grammar for the entire match. I did it with him. Jim, I think you're getting a little too cranky, so I got to jump in here and try to lighten up the mood.
Okay, because I started talking about fucking Hogwood and all that shit, and I started getting cranky again. You got to bring me back the other way.
I'm going to ask you about two things we talked about on the 605 Super Podcast, and I want to get your thoughts on them. One of them is something we talked about in last week's episode that I didn't know too much about. David Bixenspan really enlightened me to it. The death of the fake Stan Lane a few years ago. So for the people out there who don't know, a guy died, and there was an obituary in the paper that Stan Lane of the Fabulous Ones had died. He told his wife and everyone else.
Memphis, the Memphis Commercial Appeal now, big-time newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee, reported this. Yeah.
Reported that Stan Lane was dead, and his wife talked about how, she'd been with him since he retired from wrestling, even though he'd been wrestling on national television the entire time that she was married to the fake Stan Lane. And the part that I loved the best about the story was at the funeral, there was apparently a merchandise stand where they sold Fabulous Ones.
There was a gimmick table. Yes. And
now, was it really the Fabulous Ones, or was it Steve Keirn and some guy airbrushed in to be the fake Stan Lane?
No, here's exactly what happened, because I heard about this because obviously it went out on the news that Stan Lane had died, but it was in the Memphis newspaper, and I smelled something, so I called Stan, and Stan had said, "No, I'm dealing with it now." Right? Because Stan's he doesn't really pay any attention to what's going on in wrestling these days, and hasn't for years. He makes very limited appearances, as everybody knows. We got him out to WrestleCade for briefly, but anyway, it's 30 minutes from his house. Anyway, he had a bunch of people calling him, say, "Are you all right? Are you all right?" And he found out about this. So Sal Correnti, who started the Wrestle Reunion concept several years back and who refereed and blah, blah, blah. He's on the periphery of the business. Sal is Stan's contact to, keep him in touch with wrestling shit, right? So Stan is kind of de facto agent. So Sal and Stan get on the phone and they call the newspaper and they say, we want a retraction on your obituary. And they say, we've never had anybody ask for a retraction on an obituary. Is he not dead? No, it's the wrong guy. Well, we don't fact check obituaries. We just get them from the funeral home. So they call the funeral home. And the funeral home says, well, that's the information that we were given by this lady. Her husband died. He was Stan Lane of the Fabulous Ones. And Stan said, no, I'm Stan Lane of the Fabulous Ones. Well, we don't know what to do. So then they get the woman's number. They call the woman. And the woman is hearing none of this. No, my husband was Stan Lane, right? So it becomes a news story that I got interviewed. They did the Commercial Appeal did a story on the death of Stan Lane. Was not really Stan. Fabulous Ones, wrestling fans. And come to find out, the background was this couple was married in 1987. And at the time, he told her that he used to be Stan Lane of the Fabulous Ones. Now, despite the fact that Stan Lane was still wrestling on national TV as one of the Midnight Express through these years, they didn't watch wrestling anymore, so she didn't know this. And come to find out that the rest of her family knew that it was horseshit, but they didn't want to fucking pop her bubble, so they didn't tell her. So she reported all this everywhere and went through all this. And actually, by the time they had the funeral, by the time it was all sorted out later after the funeral, so they actually had pictures of the Fabulous Ones from 1982 and 83 in Memphis up at the funeral.
Were they your pictures?
Well, I don't know what pictures they said they had pictures because one person went and undercover to see what was going to happen, right? Went to the funeral. They had.
Well, it's a good thing he was dead because honestly, seriously, in some states that would be considered rape. I'm not joking. If you pretend to be someone else.
Well, but I don't think, because he was pretending to be a fucking fictitious character anyway, supposedly. She didn't know all the wrestlers are fake. Anyway, point being, they did have the pictures up and they said he looked nothing like Stan Lane. And that's why the family knew, but this poor woman bought it, and apparently when the newspaper finally called her, when all this stuff had been sorted out and called her for a comment, she didn't want to say anything because she was just so mortified over the whole thing, and she just couldn't believe it. Which I can understand that. So that's what happened with Stan Lane's death, and actually then he called me a few months later, and I answered the phone. I said, Stan, I said, I hadn't heard from you since you died. So
I heard she was.
I now know two people in the wrestling business that I talk to on a semi-regular basis that have both been dead: Stan Lane and Jerry Lawler. Because I told Lawler when I saw him after the heart attack, I saw him like 9 months later. I said, Jerry, I want to thank you for what you did for me. He said, what? I said, you died. Scared me to death. I went on a diet.
I heard the woman was consoled by a fake Brian St. John. Let's see if anyone out there gets that reference.
I do
Brian
not.
St. John was Stan's first tag team partner in Florida. Nature Boy Stanley Lane. He was trained by Ric Flair in Flair's backyard, and Brian St. John, and they won. Stan told me they won the Florida tag team title. They're both like rookies. Stan was definitely a rookie. I don't know if St. John was, but they beat Eddie Graham and Ray Stevens.
That's right.
What the fuck? He's like, what the fuck has happened here? But anyway, yes.
On the show, we joked that the fake Stan Lane was trained by Nature Boy Rick Ratchet, probably. But speaking of Rick Ratchet, that brings me to Dennis, and I want to ask you about a story because it's a story we told on the air, and it got a great reaction. And then Mark Carluzzo, my old friend, got in touch with me and filled in some of the details. And you're involved in the story, so I want to get your
okay.
So there is a WWF show, let's say in Philadelphia, and you guys are all at the hotel. And into this booking meeting in a conference room go you and Vince and Shane and JR and Bruce Pritchard and maybe a couple other people. And the shades to the conference room are
yes, open. And this, I'm going to tell you when this was before the pay-per-view. It was Mind Games, Cactus Jack,
okay.
Mankind, or whatever it was, but it was Mankind and Shawn Michaels. Because this was Philadelphia, and that was in Philly, right?
That was in Philly, I believe, yes.
Okay, so that was the night before that when it was traditional that Vince and the production crew and the creative team and everybody figured in would have a production meeting to go over the format the night before the pay-per-view and make sure that we had everything in our heads. So we're in the hotel, we're in the conference room. There's windows looking out in the lobby as well as outside, and I'm sitting there next to Vince, and we're just having this meeting, and it's going on forever. And me and Corluzzo and friends have a date at Ribbit to go have a feeding frenzy immediately after the meeting. So go ahead.
So Dennis and Mark Carluzzo are waiting out in the lobby for you to finish up, and you're taking a long time. And if you are around Philadelphia wrestling, you know that the hotels for a wrestling show are filled with wrestling fans. Tom Robinson was actually on our show a couple of weeks ago, who I know you know from the same setting. And one of the fans there this night was someone who we used to call the 35-year-old kid, Dave Baumkratz. And if he's out there listening, hello, Dave. It was just a rib. Relax. He looked like a child, but he was like 35 years old, giant glasses, wore a hat, dressed like a kid. And he was telling everyone in the lobby that Shane McMahon was a great friend of his. And he was bragging about it. So Dennis and Mark get an idea. They call the front desk and say, hey, can you get this guy? And they point him out, and he's the only one who looks the way he does. So the front desk grabs him. And Mark Carluzzo gets on the phone and says, hey, buddy, it's Shane McMahon. Can you do me a favor? We are really thirsty. Can you go buy us a whole bunch of Diet Cokes and just bring it into the conference room? Don't even knock. Just walk right in and give us the Diet Cokes. And he hangs up the phone, and Baumkratz just goes running to buy these Cokes.
Yes.
And a few minutes, and now Dennis and Mark go outside so they can watch from the parking lot or wherever inside the conference room because the windows are open. They could see in. And they said all of a sudden this serious meeting's going on, and in walks Dave Baumkratz with a tray filled with Diet Cokes, and he puts them down, and he says, okay, Shane, here's the sodas you wanted. And Shane was being nice and said, okay, thank you. And Baumkratz left, and then Vince turned to Shane and said, you're not going to drink that, are you? And the way Dennis and Mark always said it was, while this is going on, Cornette's sitting there, and he's just going, motherfucker, I know Dennis is involved with this somehow. So, Jim, I want to hear your point of view on this story.
Well, no, I knew I'm trying to remember because I knew this was going to come to this. I'm trying to remember the exact words, but I knew Dennis was involved in it because the kid on his way out, apparently the fake Shane McMahon also told him to, and by the way, and while you're in here, tell Jim Cornette that Dennis Corluzzo says, hurry up. Because that was his last word, and basically Dennis Corluzzo says, hurry up, or we got to go, or whatever the fuck, and everybody's looking at me like, you know this guy now? And so everybody knew that I had something to do with that fucking fiasco. And I'm just, but hey, at least it was, to get out of those production meetings, sometimes you had to take extraordinary measures. I almost pulled Kevin Dunn over the fucking table and beat him up. That was where Bucky Beaver came from, so I could get out of that production meeting in fucking Nova Scotia. But
I know you always say Bucky Beaver. I always thought he looked more like a bloated Nosferatu.
Max Shrek. Anybody else? Hey, now we're really getting esoteric and exotic on the podcast this week. We have had a lot of fun. As a matter of fact, we're probably about to run way over to. I think we're already over time. Well, we don't have a time. What the fuck?
We're at the exact time.
Well, I got something I want for Brian. Thank you for being on this week, but you don't get off that easy, because as my new anger management therapist, and by the way, I said I'd hired you to be that. I'm not actually going to pay you. It's going to be more in the area of praise, favors, and things like that rather than actual money. Because it seems like when I pay people to do anything related to these podcasts, sometimes that story gets switched around and I get it shoved up my ass. So I ain't paying anybody else, and that goes for you too, Em. I know you're independently wealthy.
I was really hoping for some of that Radley money. Come on.
Well, no, it's going to the ASPCA from now on, on behalf of Harley Quinn to help her underprivileged brothers and sisters. But anyway, you got to work for this. Now, I want you to do something for me as my anger management therapist. I want you to come back on a program next week. But in the meantime, between this week and next week, I want you to send me a link, as the kids do, the young people do these days, a link to something. Don't make me work for it. I just want to be able to click on it and I can watch it. Find me a couple of things about modern wrestling that I can fucking like, that I can say something positive about, that I can praise somebody about, so people will not once again think that Jim Cornette's just all miserable and just hates everything, like I hate the goddamn Republicans and the goddamn conservatives and the fucking entertainment wrestlers that super kick fucking children and fucking use their dicks to fucking beat people over the head, etc. You see where I'm going with this? Find me something else. Find me something praiseworthy, something positive, something enjoyable, entertaining, enlightening, something that'll bring a smile to this old wrestling personality's face. Brian, can you do that by next week?
I accept this challenge. This will be the first homework I've ever done without paying someone to do it for me. So you got it.
And you know what? And you also, you disprove The statement that I mentioned it earlier in the program before we brought you on, that the guy said to me on Twitter when I was plugging my New York dates in March, and the guy twittered and said, well, you always say bad things about New Yorkers. You hate New York, so now you're sucking up because you want support. And no, you're proof. I like people in New York that like me. I just don't like New York City, as you're well aware of. You've been there with me on a number of occasions, and I don't like fucking people in New York just on the street that are rude to me and fucking bunk into me and things. But I like the New York people that like me. You're proof.
I believe I'm the man who turned you on to Kosher Deli in New York City.
Yes, you are. And also, and what was that place we went to?
There was a Carnegie Deli. There was
Carnegie Deli. I know by heart. I've been there many times, even without you. But the place over on the east side, the Village.
We used to hang out before the Village was dead. We used to go to the East Village and hang out there. That's right.
Manitoba's. There you go. Famous rock and roll venue and etc. So anyway, so you'll accept the challenge and you come back on the program next week, and I will have watched these things you're going to send me, and I will tell you whether or not they brought a smile to my face and whether or not that I liked them. And that way we accomplish everything that people seem to want from me this year. I get a little more pleasant, and at the same time we talk a little more about wrestling.
I think it's great. We'll have some fun with this. For those of you out there who want to hear my podcast, it's available at 605pod.com or on iTunes or wherever you steal your media from. I'm sure it's there. Now, so 605, the Super Podcast.
You're just fucking taking liberties. I didn't even get to ask you as the host of the show. And one more time, tell the folks where they can hear you. You just come in my house, sit down, put your feet up on the furniture.
I'm going into business for myself.
Going into business for yourself.
Even I
tell you, it's just amazing. He just tracks Bud in and fucking slanders Dandy Jack Donovan, goes on about his way. Bruce, wait a minute, Bruce, the Hangman. We did real quick. Tell the folks why the Hangman is famous in wrestling, and then we'll get out of here.
I'll tell you real quick because in a few minutes I have to go sit down with my girlfriend. We're supposed to watch the 1974 Scorsese classic. Alice doesn't live here anymore. The Hangman Bruce Pobans. You hear the cackling? You hear that? The Hangman Bruce Pobans.
Between you and Bolin, I'm going to get in trouble somewhere or another. I'm trying to take the high road. Go ahead.
The Hangman Bruce Pobans was discussed on last week's episode where we discussed various fringe wrestling characters, including The Thing, who was the bodyguard for the Cocaine Cowboys. And he was a guy, Hangman Bruce Pobans, who would show up at Cauliflower Alley clubs and claim that he was the former NWA champion, that he had body slammed Andre the Giant. And he has an online testimonial, when he got all religious, that he visited a sick kid in the hospital, and all the kid wanted was to meet his favorite wrestler, the Hangman, Bruce Pobans. And now Hangman would give his young fans mini nooses. That was his handout. And I don't want to spoil the whole story, but basically the kid ends up dying, and but he got to meet the Hangman, his favorite wrestler.
It doesn't sound like there's going to be a comeback from that. So the kid dies. There's pretty much that's the end of the story. All right. I met the world famous Spoiler last year at Lexington Comic Con.
I heard about that.
About 5'4", about 160 pounds, about 50 years old, and said, he's been retired for years, but when he took the picture of me, he stopped, pulled the mask out of his back pocket, looked like it hadn't been washed in 6 years, put the mask on, and he looked up at me and said, the fans will expect this. Of course they will, world famous Spoiler. And his 350-pound girlfriend was just beaming. So I don't know. It's like if somebody came up and claimed to be Mickey Mantle at a baseball expo. It's like, why do they go to the places where, of all people, everybody that they're talking to will know they're full of shit? If you just went out in the fucking world somewhere and said, yeah, I used to be the world famous Spoiler, who's going to say no? But at a wrestling convention or with wrestling people or whatever the fuck,
Bo James actually tells a story, that a show, I think in Eastern Kentucky, which would make sense, that someone came up to him in the locker room to introduce himself. He goes, hi, how you doing? I'm Wrestling 2. And it was just some guy in a Mr. Wrestling 2 mask. He's like, you're not Wrestling 2.
He just said, you're Wrestling 2? Well, I'm wrestling also. All right. Well, that's it for another week. M, thank you for sitting and bearing up under this and listening to us. Well, we've talked about nothing.
I cuddled up in my parka and just sat back and enjoyed.
In fucking Orlando, we talked about nothing that any modern wrestling fan would enjoy today, and that's why I liked it. And I will erstwhile wait for my homework over the next week, Brian. I will hope to enjoy whatever selections you make for me, and you'll be back on the program next week, and I will report to you my findings, and everybody will be able to. And by the way, the Queen of the Castle Cornette says hello to Brian. But next week, folks, you'll find out whether even my new anger management therapist can find something about current modern day wrestling that I enjoy.